In an unprecedented move, President Biden has announced the cancellation of $10,000 of student debt for individuals making $125,000 or less. Why is this happening? What does it mean? What will the impact be on the economy, the higher ed industry, etc.? Is this constitutional? Will it happen? A lot of questions are raised by this action, and in this episode, we will unpack all of them. I'm Dr. Nolte, and this is Blind Politics. And welcome inside the American One Studios in Hampton, Virginia. I am Dr. A.J. Nolte, and this is Blind Politics. I am an assistant professor of government at Regent University's Robertson School of Government. Once again, views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of either Regent University or the Robertson School. Please remember that you can rate and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast provider. And you can find us on Facebook at Blind Politics with Dr. Nolte, as well as for the audio version on your favorite podcast provider. But we do ask that you also check out the video version on American One. That's American and the number one, your fastest rising one-stop shop for conservative media and podcasts out there today. So, President Biden, when he first ran for president, said that he was going to cancel student debt. And so now, 2 years later, we have an executive order that purports to cancel $10,000 of student debt for those who are making $125,000 or less as an individual. Now, let's unpack this for a bit. If we're talking about $125K for an individual, we're talking about $250,000 for a couple. Okay? That's a pretty decent salary. On just about any other policy issue that I can think of, if you're making $250,000, Democrats would say you're rich. Right? If it comes to raising your taxes, if you're making $250,000 as a couple, Democrats will say you're rich. But you're not so rich that you don't need your student loans canceled. So just in case you were wondering, the definition of whether you're rich or not as a Democrat depends on the policy issue and which constituency they're trying to woo at any given time. So why did this happen and how did it happen the way that it did? Well, so there are a couple of things that we want to unpack here that led up to this. All right. So first of all, in the American Rescue Plan Act, this was the first Biden COVID stimulus. A provision was entered in that bill that would have essentially said any debt forgiveness does not count as income for tax purposes if it is done before 2025. Now, why is this important? Because absent that provision in law, forgiven debts count as income, right? If somebody gives you a debt forgiveness, it counts as income. So they knew they were going to try to do this. And to try to do this, they changed the law so that if you cancel student loan debt before 2025, that doesn't count as income for the purposes of taxes. But note the date here. It says 2025. So essentially, they're setting this up to be an income-free debt cancellation. In other words, a debt cancellation that won't count as taxable income throughout the duration of the Biden administration, not throughout the duration of this Congress. What that tells me, as somebody who's kind of looking at this from more of an institutional political science perspective, is they knew from day one that they might have to do this via executive order. Because if you're thinking about trying to get this passed in Congress, you say we have to do this before January of 2023. Okay? They're probably imagining that if this happens by executive order, though, that it's going to happen after the 2022 midterms, which just goes to show that Democrats have known the midterm was going to be bad for them for quite some time. Okay, so that's point number one. Then we have the negotiations over the Build Back Better deal. And this debt cancellation package and various different forms of debt cancellation were in previous versions of BBB. But of course, none of that passed. That was not in the final package that Manchin agreed on. And that's probably because West Virginia has a low percentage of people that would benefit from this bill. It's not a state that is highly correlated with a large number of college graduates who are making, about $250K or less thereabouts. Okay. We'll get back to that when we get into the economic and political impacts of this, but This is meant to benefit certain constituencies, and that's not the constituency necessarily that elected Joe Manchin, so he says no. Okay. So then we have the passage of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of like the Holy Roman Empire, the old joke about the Holy Roman Empire, right? It's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Inflation Reduction Act is a law that will not actually do anything to reduce inflation. So, but we passed that, no student loans in it. So in order to generate increased turnout from the college educated, which is we'll come back to that in a little bit, but that's increasingly the base of the Democratic Party is college educated, more affluent voters. Democrats decided that they were going to buy them off, and so Joe Biden then comes out with this executive order on Wednesday, shortly after the Inflation Reduction Act passes. This basically tells you that Democrats are done. They're done. They're not going to try to pass anything. They know that they've gotten all they're going to get legislatively. So Biden wants to get this executive order in so that it can help with Democratic turnout in the midterms. Okay. If all of this sounds like cynical, tawdry politics, that's because it is. And so largely that's what's happening here. Now, what are the implications of this from an economic perspective? All right. First of all, based on the Wharton School of Business's estimate, Wharton School of Business, by the way, is not, in the tank for conservatives. This is the business school at UPenn, but based on their estimate, this could cost somewhere between $330 and $500 billion. Okay, that is significant. I know that may not sound like a huge number given the trillions that we've been tossing into the economy since COVID started, but that's still a pretty substantial number for one piece of legislation. Okay. Now, here's how this works. Essentially, most of the debt that we're looking at is government debt. So based on the executive order, it does not seem like at this point private lenders are covered. Okay, these are people who've taken out loans that are government subsidized. What that means essentially is the government itself is not going to be getting as much revenue. So this creates some interesting conundrums from the perspective of government revenue. And we'll come back to that as I talk about the issue of standing, because that it comes into play when we start talking about some of the legal issues and constitutional issues surrounding this. Okay, but it's not that the government is necessarily spending money. It's that obligations that people have to the government will now not be paid, and so less revenue is coming in. On aggregate, the assumption here is that this is essentially going to cost the average taxpayer about $2,000. Again, that's from the Wharton School of Business account. And that is because as that revenue from student borrowers is lost, the assumption is that revenue is going to have to be made up somewhere else. Okay. Now here's the catch, though. This is the presidential executive order. And if you remember your basic civics class, which I know as a very intelligent audience you all do, the president cannot appropriate money. Okay. And the president can't create new taxes. That has to be from Congress. So if there's going to be new appropriations or new taxes, there still has to be some sort of congressional legislation that comes from that. Now, let's drill down just a little bit more. What's the macroeconomic effect of this? Is it inflationary? Yes. Okay. It is in fact inflationary. Why is it inflationary? Because you have people, instead of paying off their loans, you have people then spending that money on other things that will cause inflation. You also have a situation where you've now set an expectation, right? People will look at this and say, well, if they did this now, what's going to stop them from doing this again? Because now you've set a precedent that this is a thing that you're going to do. That means that more people are likely to go out and take student loans, whether they should or not, because they'll assume that eventually, if they just wait long enough, the loans will be forgiven. That will then, basic economics here, supply and demand. So if you've got more people that are willing to spend more money on student loans, that then incentivizes universities to raise prices. Dirty little secret in the higher ed industry, the reason that the price of tuition continues to go up is subsidized student loans, because essentially you are giving universities carte blanche to raise tuition because you're essentially saying, as the government, we're going to fill the bill. Anytime you put intermediaries between the customer, the person who is receiving the benefit in an economic transaction, and the person who's selling them something, right? So there's an intermediary between the buyer and the seller. Then you're going to incentivize the seller to charge more because then there's that middleman that can pick up the cost. So that's where the rising cost of tuition in part comes from. So we can expect tuition rates to go up. We can expect rates of student loans to go up. And what that means is that you haven't actually underlying fixed the problem. And what that means also is that more people in the future are going to be in this exact same situation. Okay? So you are putting future borrowers in the same position. And remember that debt, the fact that debt forgiveness doesn't count as income, that only lasts until 2025. All right? So those are the economic impacts. The impact on higher ed is, I think, instead of fixing the underlying causes that are driving tuition, instead of fixing the student loan system so that it matches up more with the incentives, right? And I'm somebody who works in higher ed, and I will tell you that I think the degrees that I support at Regent are worth your money, of course. And that's not just because it's I wouldn't be working there if I didn't think that was the case. But I'm not going to say that every degree you can get anywhere in higher ed is 100% worth your money. If you're getting a BA in women's studies so that you can go be a barista at Starbucks, that's not a good economic transaction. You should just go be a barista at Starbucks. Okay? But it will incentivize more people to make those types of decisions if you essentially say, well, if you get these loans, you take out a bunch of loans, you can get some of that forgiven later on. Right? So it creates that perverse incentive. And as long as that happens, as long as we are completely undiscriminating in our student loan policy, we're giving out student loans to anybody for any degree, for any reason, right? You're going to continue to see the inflation of this bubble until people on their own realize that they're taking on huge amounts of debt. The forgiveness that they're getting from the government is not enough, and the degrees are not worth all of the hassle and all of the debt that they've taken on. Bubbles pop, inevitably. So this is not solving the problem in higher ed. It's actually just inflating the bubble a little bit more. Whether that makes it pop sooner or later, I'm not sure. But it's definitely not fixing the problem. Okay, in terms of higher ed. So that is the sort of economic impact in a nutshell. It's not going to be good. That's not even talking about what we're adding to the debt. And the reason I'm not talking as much about adding to the debt is because while this is bad and is unconscionable from that perspective, when you've added $6 trillion over the past 2.5 years, $500 billion seems like maybe it's not so bad in comparison to that $6 trillion. It's still bad, don't get me wrong, but we've already gone so far. It's like after you have bought the mansion with a subprime mortgage, and then you buy a motorcycle on top of that you can't afford. Yeah, that's a bad financial decision. But you're so far under already that it's almost not worth talking about. But yeah, it certainly is going to make the debt worse, especially if it sets a precedent that we're going to do this again every 5 or 10 years or so. Okay, so this is a bad policy. From a policy perspective, it's bad. Furthermore, there is a huge problem with this. It's not clear yet how they think they're going to pay for this. By they, I mean the Biden administration. Okay? And several of the mechanisms whereby they might try to pay with this are not constitutional. So they're going to have to do one of two things. Either they're going to have to go back to Congress and say, hey, we promised all these people we're going to forgive this debt. It's probably going to cost about $500 billion. Pretty pleased with the cherry on top. Will you appropriate $500 billion so that we can make up this lost revenue? Yeah, it's going to have to be paid for in taxes, but that's unfortunate. To which Congress is going to say no, because Maggie Hassan, Mark Kelly, Michael Bennett, all the Democrats, probably Raphael Warnock, all the Democrats that are up for re-election don't want to have to vote for that. By the way, Raphael Warnock has been pushing this. He's been one of the folks who's been pushing this the hardest, so he might want to vote for it. You should probably keep that in mind if you're a voter in Georgia, that's been one of his major initiatives in the Senate. And certainly, if you're any kind of a vulnerable House Democrat, you don't want to vote for this. Okay? This is going to be politically radioactive. Essentially, what we have here is a redistribution where you are taking from the poor and to a certain extent the very rich, but I don't necessarily expect anybody to talk about that. So people that are above that income threshold, or people that are at or below that income threshold that didn't go to college, right? So you're taking from the working class and to a certain extent the upper class, but politically that's not as important. And you're giving to the college-educated middle class, right? Republicans are already hitting on this. Tom Cotton says, why are we taking money from truck drivers to pay the student loans of rich lawyers, right? Ron DeSantis is saying, similar things. Why are we taking from workers to pay for the women's studies degrees of different people, right? So that's already radioactive. There's no way Democrats in Congress want to vote for this, right? Because right now, if they live in districts where it's not beneficial, they can stand up and say, well, we don't support the Biden administration doing this. And it doesn't really cost them anything because they're not having to buck their party on it because they don't have to take a vote. But if they don't do that, then Biden is going to have to make cuts. Again, if you can't appropriate money for something, you've got to make cuts. You've got to move money around. Okay? And that means probably cuts from the Department of Education. So depending on the mechanism they get to pay for this, that makes a huge difference, and I'll tell you why. It's probably not constitutional, what Biden has done. Okay? I say this not to be out on a limb here, but because his own Department of Education said, we don't think we constitutionally have the authority to do this. The Speaker of the House, who is of his party, Nancy Pelosi, said, we don't think Biden doesn't have the authority to do this. He can defer, but he can't forgive. Okay. By the way, there's another deferral in this as well. We're not talking about that as much because it doesn't raise as many of these issues, although it's not a great policy either. But because of that, you then have a question of who can sue, who has standing. And that's a complicated issue. To show standing in this issue, and an issue like this, you'd have to show that you're materially harmed by this policy. And courts in the past have not been very permissive of taxpayers saying that new government spending causes material harm to them. However, if they are in fact going into the Department of Education and taking money from somewhere, because if they're not going to go the congressional appropriation route, they have to do this by taking money from somewhere else or something else, right? Then that person would potentially have standing to say, hey, this materially harms me because we were supposed to get this money and we didn't. Now, if they try to pay for it out of unspent COVID funds, which is a possibility, let's say you were a school in Alabama or Texas or something like that, you were promised you were going to get some COVID funds, you didn't, right? That school district, in theory, would have standing, I think. And I've talked to a lawyer about this, and he said that I'm not crazy, right? Now, I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one on TV, but it seems to me like that's the type of situation where someone would have a claim that they are materially harmed by this. So if you can find someone who has standing, I expect this will be enjoined. An injunction means it can't take effect until the court decides. And I think this one's going to the Supreme Court. And it's hard to see how you can find in the emanations and penumbras of the Constitution the right for the president to initiate a major financial policy like this. Okay? Money is Congress's job. It says so right in the Constitution. The president can decide how that money gets spent within certain parameters. But just saying we're going to forgive a bunch of people's debts doesn't sound like something the president has the constitutional authority to do so. And I mean, I don't think I'm out on a limb here, since I'm just restating something Nancy Pelosi said. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out in that sense. I would expect this will be a legal fight. Now, I want to discuss, as we kind of close on this, a few more implications of this that are maybe a little bit more political. First of all, I think this demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that Democrats perceive the college-educated, wealthy suburbanite as their new base. Okay? Why? Because if you were primarily trying to help lower-income borrowers, you wouldn't have an income threshold this high. You wouldn't have an income threshold that's $250,000 per couple. Okay, you wouldn't have an income threshold that Elizabeth Warren thinks is rich people whenever she's trying to figure out how high taxes should be on the rich. Okay, you are essentially trying to bribe that constituency to come out and vote in the midterms. And that indicates that Democrats believe this constituency is their base. I've spoken previously on the audio version of my podcast about how we're in the process of a realignment. The Republicans are becoming a more sort of working class oriented party, multi-ethnic working class party. Democrats are becoming a more wealthy, college educated party. That trend was starting before Trump, has accelerated in the wake of Trump. And this is just more evidence of sort of that direction. Okay, so that's one aspect. Two, if you were trying to do something that would drive the Republican base to the polls en masse, you have succeeded. Okay, if you were trying to unite the more populist and the more fiscally conservative wings of the party, of the Republican Party, this is the perfect way to do it, because fiscal conservatives are like, this is financially irresponsible. It's adding to the debt. People should pay their obligations back. I mean, that's like the base of fiscal conservatism, insofar as there actually is a constituency for, you know, that type of eat your vegetables, fiscal conservative, fiscal responsibility. Like, those people are enraged about this. If you want to see evidence of this, read anything that Charlie Cook from National Review has written over the past week. He has been like Captain Ahab, and this is his white whale, and he's going after it hammer and tong, and it's amazing, and I highly recommend you read it. Just look up anything he's written, right? So that's the fiscal conservative. From the more populist perspective, right, this is Main Street. Main Street is getting screwed over to benefit Wall Street, or in this case, Cambridge, right, the ivory tower. Right? You're taking from the truckers and you're giving to the academics. It's the perfect encapsulation of populism, right? Of you are sticking it to the common man and giving to the, you're robbing from the common man and giving to the elites. I mean, that's the way this is going to play, right? So look, these two groups don't agree about a lot of things. They don't often like each other. The Chamber of Commerce and the MAGA folks aren't hanging out, you know, sipping tea together, right? They haven't been doing that since the Tea Party, pun intended. But on the other hand, you give them an issue that can unite them, that they can all agree this is BS. And all of a sudden, some of those divisions are going to go away, right? Some of those divisions will at least be forgotten. So Biden is playing with fire here. There are reports coming out that even some folks in his administration know that this has the potential to be a huge disaster. And so, you know, we'll have to see how this plays out. But if there's anything that could trigger something like the Tea Party movement in 2009, right, it's this. The question for Republicans and conservatives is, will it happen in time? The timing on this, if you're a Democrat, is diabolical, because this is happening right before Labor Day. And Labor Day is right when people really start paying attention to elections. And this is going to be the story that's fresh on their minds. All right. So if you're Democrats, you're banking on this. You're banking on the fact that the MAGA folks aren't going to come out, and that you can drive out college turnout. And this is going to be enough to save you and inoculate you from that midterm. And if you're a Republican, if you're on the conservative side, you are banking on the fact that we now have a wedge issue that can actually unite our base against this thing that's going on, and that we can actually use it to drive people to the polls. So in a couple of months, we'll see who's right. Long term, though, this is a really bad policy. It sets a bad precedent. It's probably actually going to harm higher ed more than it helps. And, you know, while it will help a narrow subset of borrowers, I think in the long run, even they will probably look back and say, was it worth it? And I suspect the answer to that's probably no. All right, that's going to be a wrap for this episode. Please remember, you can rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast provider, but we especially hope that you will check us out on American and the number one, where you have a huge amount of really good video content coming out. And so we look forward to our continued partnership with them, and thank them for letting us use their studio to record this episode today. So, for Blind Politics, this is Dr. Nolte, signing off.